We're going to take a look at a fairly general purpose design strategy for parallel programming. It's called the PCAM model, and it's so named because those are the initial letters of the 4 steps in the process. This is due to a parallel computing luminary called Ian Foster, and it's kind of a 4-step process. We're going to start out by taking the problem and trying to figure out how do we break it up in such a way that we can have multiple processors solve it. Secondly, we're going to think about how we have to communicate information back and forth between those processes. And at this point, we're still thinking about kind of the processes, not the particular mapping to the hardware, but we still want to think about what information needs to be shared between those processes. Oftentimes what we find is that the amount of communication or the amount of synchronization in a shared memory program is higher than we'd really like it to be. And so the third step is an aggregation one, where we sort of take the partitioning that we started out with, which is often sort of too fine-grained, not enough work for each processor to do, and we aggregate those things back together so that each processor has more work on its own. And then finally, we can map the tasks that we've identified to the processors of the particular multi-computer that we're targeting. So we're going to kind of look through an example of how to do this with a particular problem, and then we'll walk through those 4 steps. The problem that we're going to explore is that of image convolution. If you're a graphics person, you probably already know what this is. But the idea is that we're going to take an input image. So I've got this original image F over here on the left. And what I've tried to show here is that the individual pixels are showing up in this grid. So just to keep things simple, you could think of this as just a grayscale image where the number that's in each of the squares reflects the brightness of the image at that point. What we're trying to do in convolution is to take that 2-dimensional image and process it in such a way as to extract certain kinds of features or to make more evident certain kinds of features. So for example, in a computer vision system, one of the things that we might want to do is to, when we're looking at a scene or looking at a particular image, we might want to identify what are likely to be edges in that scene. That's often used to be able to recognize objects that are present in the scene or something like that. And one way to do edge detection is to employ this idea of convolution. So what in the world is that? Well, we're going to start out with this original image F, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply what's called a kernel. I'm calling that K here, and you can see that the kernel is itself a 2-dimensional array of values. And the idea here is that we're going to take a particular portion of the original image F, apply the kernel to it, and that's going to give us a single pixel in the output image that I've called G. And what's going on in this particular kernel, you can see the values there are 1/9 across all of the 9 cells of K. Basically what we're going to do is lay that over this portion of the image as I've shown here in the diagram, and we're going to take and multiply 1/9 times the first pixel, 1/9 times the second pixel, 1/9 times the third pixel, and so forth through to the 9th pixel. And then we're going to add those values together, and that's what we're going to put in as the pixel value for the output image at the corresponding pixel. And notice that we're sort of centered here on the value the pixel with 134 in it, and the corresponding position, sort of like 2 over and 2 down from the upper left corner, is the same position as what we're coming up with in the output image. So what we're going to do is apply that kernel, that multiplication and addition operation that I've described, to each of the pixels in the original image, and we're going to use that to derive a value for the pixel in the corresponding position of the output image. So you can see, if we just kind of think a little bit intuitively about the structure of the algorithm that's going to do this, because we're going to scan over a 2-dimensional kernel, there's going to be 2 nested loops that are going to do that. And because we're going to apply that operation at every single pixel in the original image to get the corresponding value in the output image, we're going to have 2 more nested loops that are going to iterate over all of the pixels in the original image to produce the output. So we should expect to see something like a quadruply nested looping structure going on here. And that right away should be an idea that triggers some thought about how are we going to start partitioning this when we get to that stage in this PCAM process. We want to figure out a way to distribute the work of doing the convolution across multiple processors, and we already have just a general sense of the structure of the underlying sequential algorithm. There's going to be 4 nested loops. Well, so maybe we can ask different processors to do portions of those loops or the inner loops, or otherwise partition that workload into multiple CPUs. One thing to point out before we move on is that the kernel K is of size n by n pixels, so it's square, and in our case right here, n of course is 3. It's possible to use kernels that are different sizes or that are rectangular instead of square, but we're going to pretty much stick with this example of a 3 by 3 kernel, and keep in mind that that's the value n. Here's a little more formal statement of the problem. Remember that the input image is called f, the kernel is called k, and it's n by n pixels, and the output image is called g. To simplify this expression, I'm going to introduce a new variable called n sub 2, which is just half of n. That makes it a little easier to express this as a nested sum. So when we're calculating one value of g, right, the thing that's at position xy of the output image, what we want to do is iterate over the kernel across both axes, and that's what this doubly nested summation is doing for us. So we've got I going from negative n by 2 to n by 2, and j going from negative n by 2 to n by 2. And we're going to use that in those two indices, I and j, to pull out information from the original image and from the kernel. So from the original image at a particular position xy, right, that we're calculating in g, we take x minus I and y minus j. So that's going to give us each of the pixels in the location that we're working on, the xy location from the f image. And we're going to multiply that value by the corresponding location in the kernel. So here's the original image, here's the kernel value. And then because of the double summations, basically what we're going to do is iterate over all of the cells of the kernel, and we're going to calculate this product and then sum up all the results to store in G. Now because the values that are stored in the kernel are fractional and should add up to 1, right? That's why we've got 9 cells with 1/9 in each of them. The result is going to be that the value in the G array is still going to be in the same range of values that we're getting out of the original array F. So we'll end up with a new pixel value in G that's based on the original value from the same location in F, but it's going to have some additional influence on it according to the neighboring pixels. And in this case, we're just getting a uniform average of all of those 9 pixels. There's other kinds of kernels that you can use that don't have the same value in each of the cells, and you'll have a chance to experiment with that when we do the programming exercise for this problem. So not a super complicated calculation. And again, this is just for one of the output pixels. So we also need to be able to iterate that across the entire image. So here is a sequential version of a convolution algorithm. It's always a good thing to start out with sequential code, almost always, I guess. Number one, it helps you make sure you understand the problem and that you've got a viable sequential solution, because you can, debug it, test it, try it on different images, and then starting from that point, you can then parallelize the sequential algorithm to run on more than one process. So here's a sequential algorithm for this. It's not particularly elegant and whatnot, but so we've got an integer array, a two-dimensional integer array, and there's a manifest constant here, imgy and img x. So those are obviously the dimensions, the x and y dimensions of the image, and we've called that img. So that's going to be the input image, or what we called f in the previous few slides. We also are going to be calculating an output image. I've called this the filtered image, because again, a lot of times convolution is used to take an image and filter it. I'm going to filter it for edges, or I'm going to filter it for certain other artifacts. So, but filter, or ffilt here, is the G array. and it's got the same size. Notice that I've written this in such a way that there's a little extra space on the edges. If I go back here, you'll see that I've got pixel values that are not occupying either the top or bottom row or the left or right column. That's just to simplify the way this thing is laid out, and obviously we need to deal with those kinds of edge cases and whatnot, which we'll come back to in a bit. But that's why the image array has +2 to add those 2 pixels at the edges. We're doing the calculation N2. Sadly, C doesn't allow me to have a subscript, so it's just N2. And then these are the 4 nested loops that I alluded to before. The inner loops, which calculate the convolution for a single pixel, are here. We're calculating a new value for the output pixel, the GXY here. And the way we're doing that is just exactly what you might expect. We're two nested loops. We're iterating over I from -n/2 to n/2 and over j with the same range. And then the new value is just going to be the value from the input image times the corresponding value in the kernel. And then we're going to add those up as we go through, in this case, the 9 pixels that are being consumed by the kernel. Then after we've calculated that, we're going to update the output image, storing the appropriate value, or here's the value we calculated, storing it into the output image. I'm doing this with a local variable because that's likely to be allocated as a register, and that's going to make the convolution itself more rapid. And then I'm only going to do the pointer arithmetic that will be implied by that array access once at the end, and grab the value from the register. And then, as I said, right, that whole calculation needs to be done at each of the pixels in the input image. So that's what these outer 4 loops are about, is iterating over x and y, which is a global index across the whole image, whereas I and j inside of here are indexing across the values within the scope of the kernel that's being used to form the single value that's placed into the output image down here. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the steps in the PCAM model. We're going to start with the first, obviously, P, which stands for partitioning. So at this stage, we're trying to figure out how do we take the fundamental computation that we're doing here and split it up in such a way that we could distribute it across multiple processors or processes or threads, or depending on whatever the particular implementation we're going to be creating. And oftentimes at this stage, it's good to sort of push this partitioning to maybe sometimes a ridiculous extreme. Obviously what's going on here in the calculation is we're trying to come up with a value for each of the pixels in the output array or the output image. So let's just assume that the partitioning should be 1 pixel per process. And that's what's illustrated here in this diagram. So each of these circles represents a single pixel. I think of it as a single pixel in the output image in this case. I find oftentimes it's easier to think about how to do the partitioning if you ask yourself the question, what is the responsibility of each of the processors? So in this case, we're saying, well, a processor is responsible for computing the output value or the value of the pixel in the output image for each pixel. Now, the arrows here are an indication of information that needs to be shared between the processes that are calculating these individual pixel values. Again, we're kind of taking this to a ridiculous extreme, only 1 pixel per processor, which means that we have to get information not only from about our pixel, but we also have to have information about neighboring pixels that correspond to the size of the kernel. So in order to compute, it's actually illustrated here in different colors, to calculate this pixel, we need to know the values for all of the neighbors surrounding it. And if those, at least conceptually, are stored on different processes or processors, we'd have to communicate with those other processors to get that information. So to calculate the value of 1 pixel, we have to know the values from the 8 neighboring pixels. Again, that's specific to the particular kernel that we're using, which is a 3x3 kernel. we're calculating the value for the center pixel, and we need to know the values of the surrounding ones in order to be able to do the fundamental calculation of the new value for the output pixel. And saying how we're kind of pushing the partitioning to maybe a ridiculous extreme by allocating a single output pixel per processor. We are going to back off on that, and that's often the case when we start thinking about how we do these designs. But again, it's helpful to kind of get to the really core issue of the calculation. It's also important for us to think about how are the different processors that are involved in this calculation going to interact with one another. In this case, if we're thinking that individual processes or processors are going to calculate the value of a single pixel in the output image, we might also kind of push the boundary in terms of how we think about those processors interacting with one another. Let's, for example, imagine that the processes are in a distributed memory environment. So all that a particular processor has access to is its own local pixel value. What's got to happen then is that processes that are responsible for pixels surrounding the pixel I'm responsible for have to communicate with me, and I with them. Essentially what we're doing is coming up with kind of the worst case scenario. If we have to do individual calculations on individual processors and we have to communicate with other processors every step of the way, that's kind of the worst case for both communication and computation. And we'll see, just as we're going to kind of back off from this extreme partitioning of pixels to individual processors, we're also probably going to back off on the communication requirements. But it's helpful at this stage in the design of the algorithm to kind of push it to this logical extreme, and then we'll be able to wisely step back from that in order to come up with something that we can implement physically. So let's think about that communication requirement, just as a way to kind of compare different strategies for partitioning here. I want to come up with an expression for this COM variable, which is basically just the number of communication operations that need to take place in order to calculate the entirety of the final convolution. So here in the illustration, I'm kind of showing a pixel in a corner, and if you think about this more generally, you can see that any pixel that's in the interior of the image, it's not on a boundary someplace, is going to have to communicate with 8 other processors, right? Those other CPUs that correspond to the pixels in the kernel. So we're going to start out by assuming that we're going to have to communicate 8 times the size of the image, right? That's how many communication operations have to take place. We'll assume that they're bidirectional communications, so we don't have an arbitrary doubling going on here. But so 8 times x times y is the total number of communications that are going to be required for this partitioning. Actually, that's an overcount, however. We're sort of assuming that all of the communication that needs to take place is in the main field of the image. But if we're trying to calculate the values, say, for this pixel, we don't have to communicate with 8 other processes, right? We only have to communicate with these guys so that we can cut down the number of communications by the 3 processors that aren't there for an edge pixel. And that's going to be true in both the x direction and the y direction. So starting with this overcount, we can throw away some of the communication or indicate that it's not necessary because we're at an edge by thinking about the top and bottom edges. So we're going to remove 3 communications for these 3 pixels here at the top, times 2, because there's going to be a similar case at the bottom of the image. And if we're thinking about the top and the bottom, there's x minus 2 places where that's going to happen along the entire width of the array except for the corners. And there's a similar calculation that we can do for the communication that might be necessary on the other axis. So if we're thinking about this pixel right here, we've got to communicate with these 5, but not these guys out here that are beyond the bounds of the image. So same thing here, except that now we're going to multiply our 3 missing pixels times the 2 edges, the left and the right edge, times y minus the corners. And then finally, we need to deal with the corners themselves. So if I go back to this illustration, let me put in some more pixels here so that I have a corner to deal with. The corner calculation would be able to get by without communicating with these 5 processors that are outside the bounds of the image. So it's only got to communicate with 3 in this case. So we're going to take and subtract off these 5 times the 4 corners. And that's what we get here, minus 4 times 5. And if you do the algebra, you end up with this expression for our communication. Well, that's all fine and good, but is this a good expression or a bad expression? Obviously, we're subject to increased communication requirements the larger that x or y grows, and that might become a problem. So let's think about a different partitioning that will have a different outcome in terms of the communication. Again, back here, we're assuming 1 pixel per processor. Let's relax that a little bit and partition our array into a slightly different form. So here, I've kept the y dimension the same as it was previously, but now rather than partitioning each pixel per processor, I'm partitioning a kind of a column of pixels per processor. So if we split the x-axis in m pieces, the width of each of these pieces is going to be x divided by m by y. So instead of being responsible for an individual pixel in the output, every processor is going to be responsible for this larger grouping of pixels. Now let's think about the communication going on here. Of course, for any pixel that has all of the values necessary on a single processor, we don't have to do any communication at all, right? If we're calculating this pixel right here, well, we already have on the local processor all of the other values that are necessary. We also get the benefit of these sort of simpler calculations on the edges and in the corners. But where we have an issue is when we're trying to calculate the values in the output image for the pixels that are on the edge, right? Because these guys need to have access to a group of pixels that spans not only, in this case, the 6 pixels that are on a given processor, but require communication from the corresponding 3 cells on the neighboring processor. And that's going to be the case across this entire partitioning. So let's think about the communication requirements for this. Turns out it's quite a lot simpler, just 2 times m minus 1. Go back to the picture, we can see we've got m divisions of the problem, right, running on m different processors, and each of those processors is going to have to communicate with 2 neighboring processors. I've got to communicate with the processor on my left and a processor on my right, so 2 times m minus 1. Now it turns out that I'm kind of sweeping something under the rug here. In the previous formulation, where I only had to communicate one value with a neighboring processor to get its pixel value so I could compute my convolution, in this case I've actually got to send and receive quite a lot more values. I need to send the values for the entire column next door to me and vice versa for the entire column that needs to be sent to my neighbor. So the volume of the communication goes up here. There's no free lunch. What we'll see, though, when we start talking about distributed memory algorithms, where this would be particularly relevant because we'd literally have to send the contents of those pixels to neighboring processors, we'll see that the time that it takes to kind of create a connection and get communication started tends to swamp the amount of time taken to actually do the communication. So until the size of the data that you're communicating gets very large, it turns out that it doesn't really make a lot of difference whether you're communicating 1 value or 100 values or 1,000 values, because the majority of the time spent is going to be spent in setting up the communications path. So this completes the third step here in the algorithm design process, that of aggregation. We came up with kind of the extreme partitioning back here. That was the P in PCAM. We thought about the communication requirements for that most extreme partitioning, the C in PCAM. Then we kind of backed off from that and said, okay, let's not give every processor 1 pixel. Let's do something a little bit more reasonable. We were aggregating the calculation together so that each processor had more stuff to do. And that also had an impact on the communication requirements that we saw here. So the final step then is, at this point we could conclude probably that this is a better partitioning than this, because we're going to have more work for each processor to do, we're going to reduce the amount of communication, and so forth. So although we've settled on this partitioning scheme that's both a result of the P and the A steps in the PCAM model, we still haven't really done the M step, the mapping step, that's going to place these different partitions of the problem on processors. And so that final step has some more subtlety to it. I want to just kind of give you a basic overview here. It sort of depends on the underlying hardware, right? We're always trying to think about how do we take and solve this problem using this algorithm on a particular parallel computing architecture. In the case of a shared memory system where every CPU has access to all of the application data pretty much, which would certainly be the case here in an image convolution environment if we just had a threaded implementation that partitioned the image into columns like we saw previously, it's often the simplest to just put one partition of the problem on each processor. So depending on the number of threads that you're running, you will partition the problem that many ways. And that's kind of what we did in the genome homework. On a distributed memory machine, there's a little bit more complexity here because while on the shared memory version, communication is essentially free, assuming that you don't have a bunch of lock contention, that kind of stuff. On a distributed memory machine, you actually have to do the communication manually. You have to send these intermediate values across to neighboring processors. Back to this partitioning diagram, it's clear that we've got to be able to send entire columns of values to neighboring processors and do that in both directions, right? This guy's got to send things this way as well. It has implications for how the processors are interconnected. So there's a whole variety of different options for this. We're going to, using what we have in the lab, all of the machines for our distributed memory work are going to be on an Ethernet. So they're really on Ethernet is just a big shared bus. Any computer can get access to the Ethernet, use it for some period of time, blocks other computers from using it simultaneously. So that has some pretty interesting implications for how well we can communicate. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail when we discuss distributed memory algorithms. There's other interconnects that have been used in parallel computers. So for example, a linear interconnect would have each of the CPUs just interconnected one to the next to the next. So if these are the individual computers, the C, and of course they have their own local memory, as we've seen in the previous talks. If you partitioned the image into four columns of pixels and gave one to each of these computers, there would have to be a definite communication step between each pair. And the linear interconnect here would actually facilitate that in a way that's better than what Ethernet could do, because now this processor is connected directly to this processor on a dedicated communications channel, and the same thing between this processor and this processor and this processor and this processor. So they could actually all send information simultaneously because they don't have access to, or they're not trying to do that over a shared resource. Whereas an Ethernet would be more like this, right? Everybody is talking on the same bus, the same shared bus, whereas here there's different network segments that are allocated between pairs of processors. Other multi-computers have been designed using a ring strategy, so it basically just taking that linear idea and closing the loop. So now the two processors that were on the edges of the linear array can communicate with each other directly. This general strategy is called the hypercube interconnect. Here's a simple example of a hypercube in 2 dimensions. Now each of the computers in the multi-computer has access to 2 computers directly, and all 4 of those links can be used simultaneously. There's no sharing going on, so it's similar to the linear approach. And we can go towards higher dimensions. So I can add a whole nother dimension here, and those processors will be interconnected in the same way. And then they'll also be connected to the next lowest dimension. So now I've got a cube of processors, and all of those links are dedicated to communication between only 2 processors in the whole multi-computer. So with a two-dimensional cube, I have access to 2 adjacent processors. In the 3-dimensional cube, I have access to 3 adjacent processors, and that pattern continues. In graduate school, I worked on an N-cube, which is no longer a thing anymore, but it had 1,024 processors. And if you do the logarithm, you can kind of figure out that that means that this was a 10-dimensional hypercube. So each processor was connected to 10 other processors and could simultaneously communicate with each of them because those were dedicated links. That was a very interesting machine to work on, not least of which because not only did you have to debug your parallel code, but you had to figure out which of the 1,000 processors was going haywire. One other note about the hypercube is that you can actually map these other architectures, the linear and the ring, onto the cube. So if you have the hypercube connected supercomputer, you can actually emulate these other approaches to partitioning the problem, which is really quite interesting. And then finally, there's the GPU partitioning. We're going to see that the GPU operation is quite a lot more complex than just sort of thinking about individual processors or individual cores that are accessing data for the problem in the ways that we've been describing. There's quite a lot more to it in terms of how the GPU organizes memory, how it accesses memory, how it can stream data onto different processors and so forth. So we're going to unpack that in more detail when we turn to the GPU portion of the course. Same kinds of issues arise, but they're a little bit more complex to tease out because the memory and processor architecture is more complex than just you have access to all of memory in a shared memory, or you have access to only your memory in a distributed memory machine.